Okay, so we began looking at Perek Vav. Perek Vav is entitled Raising Children, Gidol V'Chinuch Habanim, Raising and Educating Children, V'Inyanei Teichacha, and the Inyanim of Teichacha, of criticizing, correcting, chastising, and the like. And I think we began last week with the basic idea that the mitzvah of Teichacha, not just towards my kids, the mitzvah of Teichacha towards any fellow Jew, is actually a mitzvah d'oraisa. The Torah says in Parshas Kedoshim, you see somebody doing something wrong, hocheach teichiach es hamisecha, you give a person musar. And yet there are many, many tanoim in terms of how you give the musar, how you correct a person. Will the person listen? Will the person not listen? And as a result, very often the psak halacha should be that we b'dafka don't give teichacha, because it's not merely the question that it's not going to change the person. If the only downside in my giving teichacha is it's not going to work, so I might as well do it. If it works, it works. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. The problem is that giving teichacha in the wrong way can make a person much worse than he would have been without the teichacha. And therefore, in many, many ways, a person is trying to become frum, and you give him a teichacha because he's doing something wrong, and it breaks him, and he gets angry, and he gets defensive, and he leaves yeshiva. Mashenkin, if you wouldn't have said anything, he would keep on going on for a while, and eventually the mistakes get corrected. A lot of mistakes do get corrected over time. So teichacha is one of the hardest mitzvahs to perform in a right way. It's got to come with love, and it's got to come with acceptance, etc. So that'll be some of the things that the Gemara talks about. Now, with our children, we have a special chiyuv of teichacha. This is called chinuch. We're mechuyev to try to raise our children to follow the ways of Hashem. So a parent, too, has a special achrayus not to let his kids do whatever they want to do. But at the same time, Chazal gave us a very important mafteach. They say, Yamin mekareves, with apologies to lefties. Usually when we say right hand, we mean the stronger hand. The Yamin, the stronger hand, should always be drawing your children near. Affection, love. The weaker hand, push them away, is discipline, right? So the dechia, the discipline, has to be there, but it should be the weaker part of the relationship. And then the child accepts the discipline. So you need discipline. Without discipline, the child is hefker. That's not loving. What does Shlomo HaMelech say? A famous verse, even in English. Spare the rod and hate the child. It's a famous King James translation. But Chosech shifto sonei beno. He who withholds the stick hates his son. Now that doesn't mean, people say, oh, that means I'm supposed to beat my child? No. What Shlomo HaMelech says, you have to take the stick to your son. He doesn't mean literally beat your son. That's not what we're talking about. But he's talking about discipline, boundaries, structure. The Vilna Gaon says you hit him with a shoelace. It's kind of symbolic thing, a little shoelace. So the issue is not hitting, but the issue is structure. That if you really love somebody, you want them to go on the right derech, right? If I let my kid do whatever he wants, that's not love. That's neglect. Right? It's a very big mistake when people think love means I let someone do whatever they want to do. At the same time, however, the negativity should not be predominant. There's a very, very fine family therapist in Toronto, a frum woman. She writes a column in Mishpacha magazine, so she's kind of famous. Sarah Chana Radcliffe, very, very fine therapist. And she has a rule. Again, I think it's a little extreme maybe. Her rule is 80-20. She says 80% of your interactions with your children should be positive, and no more than 20% should be negative. She says that's a goal. L'maisa, most of us are not going to reach that goal, but at least we shouldn't reverse the numbers. Right? If we have 80 or more negative and 20 or less positive, that for sure is not a great thing. Okay? So that's what the Gemara himself is going to talk about, the idea of how to balance the teichacha and the discipline and the chastisement and the direction with the idea of being gentle and tolerant and not pushing too many things onto your child. So we're up to Sif Beis, Perek Vav Sif Beis. So now he makes the point as exactly what we just said. Mi shemaynea miliyasr lahakes espenai al davar shiroi liyasrei mechape olav. Any person who does not chastise, now he says hit your son, but again, hit is lavdavka, on something that the child deserves to be disciplined for, harei sone espeno. That is not love. That is hating your child, neglecting your child. Ki l'soif, yetze l'tarbis ra, because eventually the child develops habits that are destructive. And chas v'shalom, he'll go off in a bad way. And this is not only, see, it's interesting, it's not only in mitzvahs, of course, that's our main concern, but in everything. He won't learn discipline, he won't learn punctuality, he won't learn, he won't be able to hold a job, he won't know how to get married and raise children. I mean, you have to understand, a person who does not have a disciplinary structure in his life, even from a totally secular perspective, life is likely to be a failure in a million ways. So the Vilna Gaon says, that's hating your child. And again, this is the pasuk in Mishlei. I don't know why it doesn't quote the pasuk, but the pasuk in Mishlei is beferish, chosech shifto, he who holds back the rod, sone beno, hates his child. Avo misha oev es beno. If I love my child, lo dai shemiyaser oso ala roi lo. Now this we need something. Not only will you discipline him when he deserves to be disciplined, ella shedoresh alav pen asa nidnud kal umiyaser alav. Okay, so this already is a little harder for us to understand, maybe because we're too 21st century liberal. He says, not only is there an inyan to discipline your son if you clearly see him doing something wrong, but you even investigate to see if there was something wrong that he was doing. Now there's actually a shtickle chiddush here. He's actually machadesh pshat in the Gemara, and without the Gemara would even be worse. Let me just go over the Gemara. This is a Gemara in Makkas. The Gemara, we know that if a person kills b'shaygeg, you kill somebody, God forbid, accidentally, without intention, so you're not chayiv misa, but when there was, in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, there was Orei Miklat that you would go to, and you'd have to remain in the Orei Miklat until the Kohen Gadol dies, which is a very strange thing. If the Kohen Gadol dies a day after you go, you're free after one day. If the Kohen Gadol dies 50 years later, you're there for 50 years. If you die before the Kohen Gadol, you're buried in the Yer Miklat, and then only after the Kohen Gadol dies is your body removed to the family kavura. Okay, that's a question. Okay, now the Mishnah says the following. The Mishnah says that you only go to an Yer Miklat if the activity that you were engaged in is not a mitzvah activity. But if you were being oisek b'mitzvah, and that caused a ritzicha, I'll give you an example, so you don't go to the Yer Miklat, the Gayel Adam is not allowed to kill you, etc. So the example the Gemara gives is, ha'av hamake espenai, if a father is hitting his child, again I'll explain this in a moment, and chas v'shalom the child gets killed, the Av does not have to go to the Yer Miklat because he was Isaac b'mitzvah. Similarly, a Shaliach Beis Din. Shaliach Beis Din's job is to give malchus. And let's say the Beis Din said, 39 is the maximum, but Beis Din has a medical examination, how much could the guy take without dying? And let's assume they say he could only take 30. It has to be divisible by 3. So if they say, for example, he could take 29, you got to go down to 27. But 30 is divisible by 3. So the Shliach Beis Din is hitting, but he makes a mistake in his number. And he gives an extra one by mistake. So the halacha is he's still Isaac b'mitzvah and he's pater. And certainly the first 30 for sure he's pater. Because he's Isaac b'mitzvah. Now the Gemara says other activities that seem to be connected to a mitzvah are not covered by this rule. Let's say he's cutting wood for a sukkah and the blade slips and kills. So that's not a mitzvah, that's a hechsher mitzvah. That's a preparation for a mitzvah. So building a sukkah wouldn't count. But the shaliach beistin, or the av hamaka es b'nai, that is considered to be Isaac b'mitzvah. Now, what does the Gemara mean by that? A father hits his son and kills his son. He's Isaac b'mitzvah. Now, this doesn't mean the father takes a lead pipe and starts smashing the kid over the head. Rest assured, that is not a mitzvah. In fact, it could be the father wouldn't go to the miklat for another reason. He might be called a mazid, and he might be chayav misa for that. We're not talking about that. We're talking about normal discipline, but accidents happen. In other words, he's disciplining his child, and the child slips, or the father slips, and the head hits the table or something. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about the etzem discipline itself was violence. So the Gemara then makes the point that even if your son is learning well, he's done nothing wrong, and you're hitting him, he says that's also a mitzvah, because it'll prevent him from doing something wrong. Meaning, if the father kills his son in the course of what's called reasonable discipline, afal gab de gamir, even if the child is learning well, and there's no reason, right? What do they say? This is for the next time you did it, this is for the time I didn't catch, I know there's other times, right? I know kids think that's tremendously unfair. So the truth is, the Gra is giving you a shtickle chiddush, making it a little more palatable. He's saying it doesn't mean the kid didn't do anything wrong, but it means that even though it looks like everything's good, but you're dairesh v'chayker to see if there's something that needs a little tikkun. Okay, again though, you have to remember the idea here is going to be, and the Gra will say this beferish, that you're constantly disciplining your child, but we're talking about gentle discipline, supportive discipline. We're not talking about any type of physical violence. In fact, Rav Wolbe said an interesting thing. Rav Wolbe said that even though it's true that in Eastern Europe, in Poland and Lita, there was corporal punishment, meaning, again, not violence, but a parent would hit a child and the like, and not only a parent, but a cheder rebbe. Rebbes would hit. All sorts of stories about in every classroom there was this rod or this stick, or this belt that the rebbe would use, and the like. Rav Wolbe said there's a special cheshbon that bisman hazeh you're not allowed to do it, and he brings a raya from a Gemara. The Gemara says that even though a father is permitted to hit his child for discipline, but once your child is a gadol, once he's 13, you're not allowed to hit him. And the reason is very interesting, because at that age, adolescent rebellion, he may hit you back. And he's over on the Yisra D'Oraisa of hitting a parent. So you, the parent, are over on lifnei iver. If you engage in behavior that's going to cause your child to be over. It's very fascinating. It's the kid that's hitting the father. That's the aveira. But you, as the father, are responsible because you're causing the child to sin. That's called lifnei iver. So Rav Wolbe said, based on that yesod, today, it even applies to b'nai katan. Because today, kids are going to hit their parents back. They're going to do it. In Europe, there was actually a sense, in fact, I've heard it said more than once, that if you were to say, let's say somebody would have a time machine and a Yid from Vilna 100 years ago would come back, would see life today. So, okay, putting aside technology, cars, all that stuff. But, Jewish religious life, in a frum place is more or less the same. But he said, the biggest difference would be kibbud aviyim, would be the biggest difference. That in Europe, there really was a concept of kavod and deep awe for your parents, even if you were not religious, even if you went off the derech. So a guy might not mind smoking on Shabbos if he was porek ol. He would never, ever, ever dream of smoking defiantly in front of his parents. Now, you might argue, well, he's not worried about a Kadosh Baruch Hu. Why is he worried about his parents? Okay, maybe that's a taina. In fact, maybe that's even a chisaron, that he's putting his parents covered more than a Kadosh Baruch Hu. But still, that was a fact. There was this notion of, I'm not going to... You see it by Esav, right? Esav wants to kill Yaakov, but Esav says, I'm going to wait till my father dies. That notion of keep it up, I'm going to wait, and then I'll murder him. So today, it's not that way. Today, every little kid, my father hits me, I'll hit him back. He pushes me, I'll push him back. So Rav Alba says, the lumdus of lifnei iver, not causing your child to do an aveira, it says even applies to b'nai katan. Therefore, today you can't use corporal punishment because the child will not be makabel. And for carrot, the child will come back. The child will come back and hit the parents. He says, you see, the Revolver says, you see a 3-year-old is going to raise his fist, to his father. All right, you got to be careful. So again, even though the Gra is going to mention, because that was hitting several times, but the ikar is not hitting. The ikar is the discipline and being sure that your child is going in the right derech. Okay. And now in Sif Gimel he says, this doesn't only apply to your boys, it applies to your girls too. Gamis habanai sarech lahadrich tamid. But obviously the chinuch is in a different direction. With boys, the ikar chinuch is to be madrich them in Talmud Torah and learning. Girls are exempt. Remember that the Gra is pre-Beis Yaakov. Remember that. If you would look, go back to the Gra's time. Go back 200 years ago. Actually, go back 100 years ago. No, more than that. Go back 150 years ago. There were no Beis Yaakovs. There were no particular schools for girls. Some girls learned privately, and they actually knew Chumash, and they knew a lot of things. There were learned people. There were women who knew Shas. That was always the case. But the average girl didn't necessarily know a lot. But it was not considered that important because they lived in a very closely knit family, and they absorbed the Messiah, and they knew how to do mitzvahs because this is what they were taught, how to do mitzvahs. So there was actually no need necessarily for a formal book learning education. A woman didn't have to know, Ramban, or didn't have to know Rav Tzadok, or whatever it is, because there was, to use a fancy English word, there was a very powerful mimetic culture. Mimetic means imitate. You simply learn by what your parents did, what your mother did in particular. A girl would learn from her mother. Now there was, in fact, many, many women didn't even know how to read Hebrew. There used to be in the Esras Nashim a female who was called a Zagarka. She would say the tefillas for the women. And also there are many techinas in Yiddish. There are books of Yiddish prayers that women said. And then we have the immortal Yiddish book, Tzena Urena. Tzena Urena is now ArtScroll translated into English, and this was a while ago. Tzena Urena were Yiddish renditions of midrashim and perushim that women could enjoy, even though they couldn't read Hebrew. And obviously, Tzena Urena became very popular for men as well. It was written for women, but it became popular for men. Number one, there's good stuff in there, and number two, not all men were able to read the midrashim in Hebrew as well. So there always were learned women, but there were many women who were not learned, and there were not schools for women. And they learned through a Messiah of their families. At the time of the Gra, that was Vadai the case. What happened when Sarah Schnerer in Krakow, I don't have the exact date, but it was the early 1900s, when she started the first Beis Yaakov, the first girls' school. And Beis Yaakov then spread throughout Poland and then eventually throughout the world. United States, Eretz Yisrael, Beis Yaakov. So there were a lot of people who were against it, a lot of Chashuvah people, particularly among Hasidic rabbis. They thought this is a pirza, this is becoming modern, women's liberation. whatever it is, they were against it until the Chafetz Chaim gave Haskamas, and the Ger Rebbe, Ger was huge, Ger was the largest Hasidus in Poland. Ger Rebbe said it was okay, and then it became an acceptable thing. And someone asked Rav Shach many, many years later, who would he designate as the greatest Marbitz Torah of the 20th century, of all the great Rosh Yeshivas? Like, who was? So it could be Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, Rav Chanan Wasserman, the Chafetz Chaim, Rav Chaim Ozer. Like, who is the greatest of them all? So he said Sarah Schnerer is the greatest of them all, because by giving women this chinuch in which they appreciated Torah, they were machshav Torah, that enabled generations of B'nai Torah to continue to learn. Because if you didn't have women who encouraged their husbands and who encouraged their children, then there wouldn't be any Talmidim in yeshivas at all. So it's the Beis Yaakovs that indirectly created the Ruach for the whole building of the Torah world. He says, who's the biggest Marbitz Torah? He said, Sarah Schnerer was the biggest Marbitz Torah. Of course, we might say later that maybe Art Scroll is the biggest Marbitz Torah, in a different way, by making everything so available. So what was happening? Meaning, how come in the time of the Gra and even much afterwards, you didn't need these schools, and then all of a sudden we need these schools? Like, why do we need these schools now? Or when Sarah Schnerer started it. So the answer would be that there was the impact of modernity, particularly on Jews living in bigger cities like Krakow, Warsaw. If you were living in villages, maybe it was less so, but in the big cities, there was a lot of secularism, newspapers, movements like socialism, like Zionism, plays, movies. In fact, there were girls from Hasidic homes. They were still nominally Shomer Shabbos. They would buy their tickets before Shabbos, and it's like Krakow had an Erev, and they would go to the movies on Shabbos. Now, actually, technically, what prohibition? why can't I go to the movies on Shabbos? If assuming go to the movies at all was a pirza, but it says even on Shabbos, right? I'm not handling money. I have an Erev, so I can carry the ticket. So I give the ticket and I watch a movie, right? So there were things like that going on, which even if technically, it was not a problem, but it was undermining the spirituality, the ruach. And Sarah Schnerer saw that would be a great sakana for Klal Yisrael. The men, the boys, they went to Hasidic tishas. This is a long problem. Part of the problem was that women weren't, men were going to tishas, men were going to rebbes, and they were leaving the women at home, which is also a bit of a problem. So what's a girl supposed to do? She's not learning Gemara, she's not doing this and that. So she goes to a movie, whatever it will be. And sometimes they left women alone for 3 months. There were Hasidim who would go to Ger, like from Rosh Chodesh Elul till after Sukkot. So you're talking about a month and a half. They would leave for a month and a half. So Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Simchas Torah, the women were left alone because Ger had women couldn't go to Ger. There was no place for, unless you lived there, there was no place to accommodate thousands and thousands of women coming. So Sarah Schnerer saw a breakdown in the family, a breakdown of girls' connection to Yiddishkeit. The truth is, things were happening with the men as well, on a different level, but this is what Beis Yaakov was. So the Gra, even though in the time of the Gra, they didn't have girls' schools, they didn't have Beis Yaakovs, but you still have to pay attention to Chinuch Habanais. And it's interesting what he emphasizes. He says that what do you train your daughters? Shelo Yetze Mipihen. Actually, it's a little bit of a dictic mistake here. It shouldn't say Lo Yetze Mipihem. It should say Lo Yetze Mipihen. But okay, sometimes the Svarim are not medayik. That should not come out of their mouths klala, swearing, cursing, shavuos. People make oaths. A person says he swears by God, such a thing. One should not make a shavua. Kazav, lying, machlekes. dissension, quarreling, fighting, lashon hara, rechilas, gossip and lashon hara, ushmiras kol mitzvahs. I gotta train my children, my daughters too, in these midos tovos and in keeping mitzvahs. V'yim lo yishmu, and if they don't listen, sarich lahakei seisam. Again, hitting in the sense of discipline. Shlo l'rachem, and don't think that by letting things go, I am showing my mercy. Sarich lahadricham, and especially you have to teach them that Shabbos Kodesh will be itay sapnai on Shabbos and in other free times. They should be Isaac in Musar and things about Tikkun Amidah. So yes, women don't learn Gemara. They learn Musar. Now Musar can be very broad. If a person learns Chumash and emphasizes in Chumash the ethical lessons, that's Musar. Musar is Lav Dafka, Mesila Shesharim. But Musar is in Yonim that are Isaac in Emunah, in Bitachon, in Midas. It's interesting that we have from the Gra, Igeres HaGra. Many Sidurim have it. Igeres HaGra is a letter that the Gra wrote to his family when he left to go to Eretz Yisrael. He came back. He never made it to Eretz Yisrael, but he had decided he was leaving by himself. He left. He was gone for a few months. He came back without ever having arrived. And I think I mentioned to you more than once that there's still a bit of a mystery why the Gra turned back from coming to Eretz Yisrael. He left, but he never made it. I think I mentioned to you that some say he went to Amsterdam to retrieve the lost writings of the Ramchal about Mashiach, and he thought he would go to Eretz Yisrael and be Makarev the Geula, and then he saw with Ruach HaKodesh it was not the Zman of Geula, so he came back. But in the Igeres HaGra, he writes a very interesting thing. He writes to his mother about taking care of his daughters and being sure, his mother and his wife, that everybody should be B'derech HaYashar. And he actually says that the girls should not go to shul at all. The girls should never go to the Beis Knesses. Because they go to the Beis Knesses, and there's going to be Lashon Hara, there's going to be machlokas, there's going to be competition, I guess maybe the way people dress. That's more so with women than men, because men tend to dress kind of the same. Women dress differently, so there's competition. So he actually had the shita that women should not even go to shul. Now again, does that apply to every woman? Does that apply to every shul? Lav davka. But he basically felt that there should not be involved in that many public things. Okay. Now, Sif Dalet, Kishemake Esbenai, when a person does discipline his child, Lo Yaka Isai Makas Oyev. You don't hit him like you're hitting an enemy, Derech Kas Ala Avar, with anger and fury. Rak Kavana Sahaka'a Tia Leatziloi Mina Asid. So this is an interesting psychological idea. When you discipline a child, you're not punishing him for the past. You're trying to correct him for the future. Because what's past is past. What am I punishing? It already happened. That's not the thing. You're not punishing him for what he did, but you're providing a disciplinary framework so he will not want to repeat that again. And that has to be your goal. Your goal has to be mechanech him. I think I mentioned last week, I don't remember, what I heard from the Bosner Rebbe. This is the father of the present Bosner Rebbe. This is Rav Levi Yitzchak in Boston. I mean, I knew him from Brookline, Massachusetts, but then he came here. He founded the Bostoner community in Harnof. When I was growing up, I'm from New England, and I first heard of the Bostoner Rebbe. I knew Lubavitcher Rebbe, Gerer Rebbe, Belzer Rebbe. All of these are European cities. So I figured, there must be in Poland a place called Boston. I don't know what it was. But no, Boston Rebbe is Boston, Massachusetts, indeed. He was the Boston Rebbe and the like. A very, very wonderful person. He used to have, I tell you, I lived across the street from the Boston Rebbe, or from his shul. And I was there quite often. I was there with 100 other people. He would have like 100 people for every Shabbos meal. Mainly college students, graduate students, and the like. And Rav Gottlieb was a little before my time. Was very, very close to the Boston Rebbe. That was really his Rebbe. That was Makar of him. But the Boston Rebbe had one little quirk. Obviously, when you have 100 people at a Suda, it takes a while till everybody sits down, and right, it takes a while. But they have a thing. The Boston Rebbe held al pi Kabbalah that you don't make Kiddush between 6 and 7. Between 6 p.m. and 7 p.m. Because the mazel that shaylight on the world is during that hour is Madim, the red planet Mars, which is bad mazel. Which means if davening was over, let's say 5:45, if Kiddush was not made by 6, you'd have to wait till 7. So I always remember the times of during those time of year when Shabbos, when Ma'ariv is over, like 5:30, 5:45, this absolutely mad, crazy rush to get everybody seated, have Kiddush by 6, because we knew that if we weren't ready for Kiddush by 6, or if Kiddush wasn't said before 6, we got a whole hour delay, right? So there's like crazy people like stampeding, to get straight. Huh? I think you have to finish. I think you have to finish Kiddush. Yeah, drinking of Kiddush, right? So there was always this mad rush there. But the Boston Rebbe, I remember, told us a Maisa that his father, who actually was the first Boston Rebbe in America, came over from Europe, and he started a Hasidus in Boston. His father used to hit him, but whenever he would hit him, he always waited 24 hours before doing it, because he wanted to be sure that he wasn't acting out of anger. He thought about what is the best thing to be madrich my child. If he decided after 24 hours that hitting was the right thing, he did it. But it was never like, I'm angry, so I hit my child. You don't hit your child because you're angry. In fact, you don't yell. It's not just hitting. You don't discipline your child at all because you're angry. Again, this is a high madrega. I'm not claiming that I've always achieved this either. You do it because this is what is best for the chinuch of your child. So, as a result, his father had a shita that he would never discipline him without waiting for 24 hours. Now, I once heard from a child psychologist that she actually didn't like this idea because she says, depending on a young kid doesn't remember what he did 24 hours ago, that you kind of have to have a cause and effect relationship for the kid to understand. Okay, a year, so 24 hours is a long time, but at least let's say 3 minutes or whatever it would be, some type of waiting period. And then there's a ma'aseh with the Stipler, not about Teichacha, but I think it's relevant to this. The Stipler, well, today, when you ask people who the Stipler was, they'll say Rav Chaim Kanevsky's father. When I was in yeshiva, even if we had heard of Rav Chaim Kanevsky, and he wasn't necessarily so famous then, we say Rav Chaim Kanevsky was the Stipler's son. The Stipler was a great gadol, the brother-in-law of the Chazon Ish. He married the Chazon Ish's sister. I remember, Derech Agav, I was zeicha to meet the Stipler once. Now, the Stipler was very deaf. He was deaf, actually. He goes back from the Russian army. I think he was on guard duty. He was drafted in World War I. And he had guard duty in a Russian winter. And Russian winters are cold. And they have a hat that goes over the ears. So somebody has told him that the hat might have shatnez in it or something. So he immediately took off the hat. And because of that, I think he had a punctured eardrum. I think his hearing was damaged because he would not wear a suffix shatnez, even though it might have been pikuach nefesh, right? One might say pikuach nefesh, but what was his cheshbon? he made a cheshbon that some would say is not a proper halakhic cheshbon, but this is cheshbon was, well, listen, if I go a minute without the hat, it's not pikuach nefesh. So I go a minute. The next minute is not pikuach nefesh. He kept on doing it minute by minute. But because of this, the Stipler was very hard of hearing. So when I came to see him for something, was I married? Yeah, I think I just got married a few months before. So I come into the room in Bnei Brak, and it's like a pretty dark room. There's just a light over where he's sitting, a light. A lot of svarim, and a lot of kvitlach, a lot of notes people gave, because the way you communicated to him, it's not just names, but anything you wanted to ask him, you'd write down. And he's like falling asleep. He's sitting up, but he's falling asleep over the svarim. So I'm not going to wake him, so I'm just standing there. All of a sudden, he wakes up with a start. And he starts screaming at me. I was scared to death. Now, he was screaming at me not because he was angry. A deaf person talks very loud. A deaf person doesn't know how loud he sounds. So he starts screaming at me. And what was he screaming about? He actually was upset, but that's not why he was screaming. He was saying, he's pointing to the kvitlach. He says, why do people give me notes? He's asking me, why do people give me notes? He says, I'm an old man, I'm going to die soon. He says, I just want to sit, I just want to learn. People don't let me learn. People don't they come to me for a bracha, they should go to Hashem. Why do they go to Hashem? Why do you go to Hashem? Why do you go to me? Who am I? So, I nod, I commiserate. I know it's tough. And I give him my note. It was actually very nice. He was actually very nice, but why do people come to me? Okay. But they tell a Maisa about the Stipler though, and this is going to be connected to the Gra. The Maisa with the Stipler was that one time in the middle of Bnei Brak somewhere, on a rainy day, he shows up at a bar mitzvah in a shul that's like 2 miles from his house. There's a mitzvah going on. He shows up. People are pretty amazed. The Stipler walks in, one of the Gadol Hador. I mean, they're very honored to have him, but they have no idea why he's there. The family didn't know him. And he goes over to the bar mitzvah boy. He shakes his hands. He speaks like 1 minute with him. Then he turns around and he walks home. And again, I've seen this type of the walk. And towards the end of his life, walking 10 feet was laborious. He had difficulty breathing. And he walked 2 miles back. So he walked 4 miles to talk to this kid. So everybody's amazed. They surround the kid and they say, what did he say to you? So the kid said, he asked my mechila. Huh? What's the story? 4 years before, when the kid was 9 years old, he was davening on Rosh Hashanah with his Zaidi. His grandfather davened in the Stipler show, called the Letterman show, the Kinevsky show, famous. Well, it's famous because of the Kinevskys, but the famous show in Bnei Brak, the Letterman show. And the grandfather had a big machzor, big print, the size of a Gemara. They have machzorim that are really, really big. And the boy is carrying this machzor to his grandfather, and the Stipler thought it was a Gemara. And the Stipler said to the 9-year-old, now is the time to daven. It's not the time to learn Gemara right now. So the kid showed him it was a machzor. So the Stipler said, oy, I was pogea in your kavod, I insulted you. I hurt your feelings. How old are you? He says, I'm 9. He says, oy, a katan can't be meichel. I'm mechuyev to ask mechila, but a katan can't be meichel. So tell me when your bar mitzvah is. So the kid said, well, my bar mitzvah is whatever it was, Parshas Truma, 4 years from then. 4 years later on the bar mitzvah, the Stipler shows up just to ask the child mechila for what he had done 4 years earlier. What did he do 4 years earlier? He just said to the boy, don't learn now. So, this is an amazing story. It's an amazing story on many, many levels. But one of the amazing things that you learn from the story is that which you do to a katan can even be a bigger avera than that which you do to a gadol. I do something to a gadol, I can ask the gadol mechila, and the gadol can forgive me. I do something to a katan, even if the katan says, I'm mochel you. Halachically, it's not a mechila. The avera is still there. So, if a parent disciplines a child, and he does it l'shem shamayim, and he does it in the right way, he doesn't have to ask mechila from his child, because he was acting al pi din. But that does mean, l'chayra, if I go beyond the gevul of what is proper chinuch, in a sense, I hurt my child. I'm mechuyev to ask mechila from my child. My child cannot be mochel me. So you got to think about that. That we sometimes think as parents, they're my kids. I can do what I want with my kids. Not really. Not really. Pumfakert. What you do with your less than bar mitzvah kids might even be worse than what you do with your more than bar mitzvah kids, because of this idea of mechila. So that's why it's so important, going back, that when you're makeh b'nai, it is not for the purpose of punishment. It is to be matzil him min ha'asid, v'lo yavel oid d'durachav, that he should not pervert his ways, and therefore al yaka oso harbe b'pamachas, ma'at, a little bit at a time. Uchsharaya sheraba chamasayela, very important. When you see that you're angry, lo yaka oso klal ba'isei. Exactly what the Bosner Rebbe's father said. You do not discipline your son at a time when you are angry. For a very simple reason. Because when you're angry, you will not measure it in the appropriate way. Got to calm down. That's a very big avodah, because b'dafka, when do we want to say something? When we're angry. It says that's when you don't say things. Right? Calm down. When you calm down, right? So people think timeouts, right? You give a timeout to your kids. Adults need a timeout. It says, I'm upset. I give myself a timeout, and then I go back to my child. Okay? So it's very important. Again, I want to make the point that even though there are a number of passages in this parak in which strong discipline and hitting is mentioned over and over and over again, you also have to balance it with the idea of softness and gentleness and not being angry and focusing on the future. Now, there's another implication about focusing on the future. This is a very interesting point we could talk about. Again, you're not punishing for the past. You're trying to correct the future. There's an interesting implication about this, and that is, there are certain types of things that kids do that they're not going to do as they get older. They only do it because they're kids. So a number of mechanchim and mechanchais say that any behavior that's not going to be a problem when they become an adult, you don't have to focus on so much when they're kids. So, an example, let's say a kid is jumping on the couch. Jumping on the couch, right? You don't want them to jump on the couch. Now, the kid is 5 years old. When they're 15, again, every case might be different, he probably will not be jumping on the couch. So this is a problem that's going to go away. So problems that are going to go away, don't bother with so much. Let them be wild. Now, it's a little more complicated. The reason why it's a little more complicated is it depends what you mean when you say the problem is going to go away. In other words, maybe the problem of jumping on the couch will go away. But on the other hand, if it's a certain attitude that I do what I want whenever I want, that may not go away, and it may manifest itself in other ways. So it is subtle. It's not so pushing. But certain inyanim, don't make a big deal. A kid is clumsiness might be an example. Kid takes out a bottle of milk, something in a glass jar, slips from his hands and breaks. Says, you don't have to make a big issue about that. Because the goal is not to punish for the past. The goal is to be miyasher, to be machanechim for the future. What do they say? Again, with Chaim Kanievsky as a child, the Chazon Ish was basically almost a second father to Rav Chaim Kanievsky. The Chazon Ish himself did not have children. But he was, number one, he loved children, and in fact, he actually had children live in his house, some of whom were not even religious. He had kids in his house, and they speak about it with great love to this day. But he was especially close to the Steipler's children. Chaim Kanievsky was had two Gedolim as fathers. He had his Steipler, which was his father, and he had the Chazon Ish, who was his second father. And they were once walking on Shabbos or something, and Rav Chaim, who was a little boy, just started climbing a tree. So the Steipler was very embarrassed. The Steipler had tremendous yira of the Chazon Ish. It was, even though you might say in a sense they were like equal, they were in the same league, but the Steipler had a moiridik, a yiras hakavod for the Chazon Ish. He was mavatal himself to the Chazon Ish, and he was very embarrassed that his son is like climbing a tree in front of the Chazon Ish. And the Chazon Ish said, maybe it wasn't Shabbos, because Shabbos is a halachic problem, but let's say during the week. And the Steipler apologized for Chaim being wild. And the Chazon Ish said, a little kid is supposed to climb trees. There's nothing wrong with climbing trees. And later they'll climb different trees. They'll climb the trees of Torah, the trees of Yiras Hashem. Let them climb trees. Kids have to play. Kids have to explore. Right? So Elamai is a little wild. Okay. He won't be wild later. Right? So because you're focusing on the future, you're not focusing on every little thing that's going on now. Because if you don't, every parent knows this, if you don't choose your battles, if everything becomes a battle, if it's not perfect, then you're never going to achieve anything. You can't fight over everything. So you got to decide what is important, what is less important. I will be aimed on the important things, and I'm not going to deal with the little unimportant things. This reminds me of with the Chafetz Chaim. The Chafetz Chaim was married twice. Most of his children was from his first wife. When he married his second wife, I believe he only had one daughter, his Bas Sekunim, who married Rav Mendel Zaks. And she lived a long time. She died, I think, in the late 70s. I don't know exactly, but within our generation. And people loved to talk to her because she was the one who had a literal memory of growing up in the Chafetz Chaim's house. So she told a lot of stories. One story that she would say is that her father was never makbid on inyanim of kavod. So even though for kibbud aviyim, a child is not supposed to sit in his parent's chair, but the parent could be mochel. Chafetz Chaim didn't care. You could sit in his chair. You could take his coat, wear his hat. It didn't bother him at all. What was he makbid on though? He was makbid that, like the Gemara says, that you have to be emes, don't speak lashon hara, don't say bad things about people, don't get involved in machlokas. And he was very makbid that out of your mouth should only come emes. Because sheker is mashchis your neshama. Lying is mashchis your neshama. So she told the story, such a cute story, that when the Mishnah Brura was printed, right? So a normal Mishnah Brura, or the original Mishnah Bruras, were 6 volumes. Now they have different ways of printing it, but the standard Mishnah Brura is 6 volumes. And when books come back from a printer, you often have to flip through the pages because sometimes pages are blank. So the Chafetz Chaim would not sell a sefer until he had flipped through it. So he would ask his daughter to help him, meaning, flip through the Mishnah Bruras and, set aside the volumes that are blank pages. So he gave her 10 sets to do, meaning that would be 60 volumes to go through. Now she was going to go out and play, And he says, come on and do these 10 sets. And she said, I can't. The Chavetz Chaim says, I can't, Abba, I have to play, whatever it is, I'm going out to play. He says, when I come back, I'll do 100 sets. But I can't do the 10 now. Okay. So the Chavetz Chaim didn't say anything. So she comes back like 2 hours later, and there's 100 sets of Mishnah Berurah. There are 600 volumes on the table. And he says, you got to do 100. You got to do 100 sets. So she says, Abba, all you told me to do was, 10 sets. Now I have to do 100 sets? He says, you said you're going to do 100. He says, a Jew has to keep the emes. You can't lie. You said 100? So he wasn't even punishing her. He was just being madrich her that what you say, like the Torah says, kol hayotze mipiv yasa. Whatever comes out of your mouth, you have to keep. So she said that emes, he was machmer. He was not makbid on kavod, but he was very, very makbid on emes. So she then said a cute thing. She said, sometimes living with such a tzaddik was not easy. She sometimes needed a break because he was always like, giving tochacha, giving musar, hadracha, in a very gentle, kind way. But he was always like telling his children how they have to live up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu's ratzon. So she said she sometimes had to get away from it. So she said she would often go into the cemetery in Radin because the Chavetz Chaim was a Kohen. He could not go into the Beis HaKvoros. And Bas Cohen could go to a Beis HaKvoros. She would go to the cemetery even at night. So at a very young age, she was not scared of cemeteries because that was like her playground. She could escape sometimes from if the Musar was too. So people loved. She would tell a lot of the stories. So she was a Bas Sekunim of that. So the point I'm making is, once again, that you got to choose what you're makbid on. The Chavetz Chaim could have been makbid on kibbud avayim and all sorts of other inyanim, but he chose to focus on a few things in order to be mechazek his children in those inyanim, and other things he was mochel on, he was mavater on. He didn't want to make a fight about everything. Okay. 1 second. Sif Hey, last one. V'tzarech leichiach es abanim harbe b'dvarim rakim. The teichacha must be with soft words. Divrei musar misyashvim al halev. Words of musar that settle calmly in the heart of a person. Sweetness. Ho'iker b'chinuch v'hergel. And the way a person is trained is by habituation, meaning the more you train your kids to do things, the more it becomes part of their nature. And he says, Taka, Dibor v'amidai sarech hergel rav. Speech and character take a lot of habituation, meaning it takes time. It takes time. Listen, how long does it take for us to change our midos, if we ever do? Right? We sometimes expect our kids to be instant tzaddikim. But he says, no, there's a process. It takes time. Which means you have to know that it takes time. And therefore don't expect instant results. And indeed, in the beginning, things are very, very difficult. Things are very difficult to get up for davening, to learn in a morning seder. Very, very difficult. Nosson Tzvi Finkel, who went to a co-ed high school in Chicago, from home, very chashuv home. So he came to Mir after high school. Of course, his great uncle was the Rosh Yeshiva of Mir, Rav Lezer Yudel Finkel, the son of the Alter of Slobodka. But still, he had never learned. He had gone to a co-ed high school. So what was Gemara? So they did, at a maximum, an hour and a half of Gemara a day. That was maximum. So he goes to Mir, and his uncle, or his great uncle, sets him up with the chavrusa to learn 4 hours. 9 to 1, 4 hours. Unbelievable. So after the 4 hours, he's totally mentally exhausted. He had never done this in his life. So finally, panting, half dead, he says, "So what do you guys do in the afternoon here?" They go touring or whatever it is. He says, "No, we just do it again." he says he couldn't believe it. He couldn't believe it. But it's hergon. Over time you do it, you get used to it, you love it, etc. But it takes a long time, right? So you can't expect, any type of instant connection to this. And that's what the Gemara is saying. So essentially, the idea that you need hergel rav, you need a lot of habituation, is really a reminder to parents, or rebbeim, whatever it is. You got to give these things time. And in time, things will often kick in. And kol haschalas kashas, the beginning is very, very difficult. V'yachar kain, v'yoizolai, o yishalel. That as you go in that path, oz, this is a pasuk, yishalel, you will be praised, meaning when a person eventually dies, he will be praised, even though the beginning was so difficult and the tsar was so great. Because a rasha biatzma yedeya, shera umar darko. Even a rasha actually knows that he's going on the wrong road. I don't mean a tziduk, but a rasha, he knows that this is a dead end or a destructive end. But it's too hard for him to get off that road. Right? Because it's hard. So the difference would be, one person says, okay, it's hard, but I know this is the best way to go. The other person says, it's too hard, so I'm just going to stay on this road for a while, even though I know where it's taking me. Now, that sounds crazy, right? That sounds stupid. But that's the reality that we often live with. In which I'm going to go the easy way, even though it's taking me, to a real bad place. But right now it's easy. Right now it's pleasant. Right now it's less stressful. The other way is going to be so hard, even though it's going to lead to something great. So he says that the ikar in chinuch is to habituate a child as early as you can, and then he'll be able to stay on that road, right? So again, you see where the Gemara is going with this. He's basically saying that you're not disciplining out of anger, you're not disciplining out of revenge, you're not disciplining out of hate. God gave you a gift, the gift of a child, in which you can be a partner with Hashem in directing the child, molding the child, bringing out the child's inner greatness. And every decision you make has to be geared towards that end. And all discipline has to be focused on whether, will this help me achieve that goal, or will it not help me achieve that goal? If it's not going to help me achieve that goal, then it's no good. It's not the way I should go. Right? So this is the important idea. Okay, we'll stop here. Everyone should be zeicha. I mentioned the Chassam Sofer has a interesting ha'ara on Asara B'Teves. He says that Asara B'Teves is the Yom Hadin for Binyan Beis HaMikdash. Just like Rosh Hashanah is the Yom Hadin for who will live and who will die. Asara B'Teves, the Eibishter decides whether we will be zeicha to the Binyan Beis HaMikdash in the year Tafshin Pei. So it's mamash Yom Hadin, that we could be zeicha, that Hashem will be geyser, that the Mikdash will be built this year, or chas v'shalom we could have a gezerah that it will not. So just as we wish people for Rosh Hashanah kesiva v'chasima taiva, so for Asar B'Teves as well we should have a kesiva v'chasima taiva. Okay.